Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Omni viewer, and I'm here with another Author's Take On video. This time, much like the very first one of these I did, in response to another video from another channel that I saw recently. Now granted, I'm a little late in responding to this one, seeing as how it was uploaded more than a year ago, but better late than never. I only just saw it a little bit ago, and I feel like there's something in it which needs addressing. The video in question is by The Closer Look, regarding the latest reboot of the Predator franchise entitled The Predator. Because when in doubt about what to call your movie, just put "the" at the beginning and everyone will know the difference. Somehow. Specifically, I want to respond to one thing said in the video. For the most part, I don't have anything else to respond to because I have yet to see The Predator, so I don't know if The Closer Look's take on the movie is something I agree with or not. But there is one statement he makes that I can definitely respond to. The statement that horror and comedy cannot and do not mix. The argument made is that horror and comedy as genres are two extremes that are on the exact opposite sides of each other, and therefore they can never blend. It's like trying to mix hot and cold. You might like nice cold ice cream and you might like a cup of hot tea, but you would never pour the hot tea over the ice cream because what you would get is just a soupy, disgusting mess. Now, it's possible that upon hearing that, you may have already thought of a counter-argument, specifically the one I'm about to use. Because there is a mixture of hot and cold that can work quite well. It's actually pretty popular when you think about it. Mixing ice cream and hot fudge. That's a pretty popular combination. You heat up some hot fudge until it's a nice warm temperature and you pour it over the ice cream. Some people like their fudge piping hot, some people just like it room temperature, but nevertheless, especially if you like it piping hot, that's a mixture of hot and cold that lots of people will tell you works quite well. Of course, that particular example wouldn't support the argument. So naturally, The Closer Look had to use something that couldn't possibly mix with ice cream in order to make the point. It's a logical fallacy, make no mistake about that, but there is a way it could have been salvaged. If the argument had been, comedy and horror can mix, but not all kinds of comedy and horror do, just as not all examples of hot and cold are able to mix, but some can, well, that would have salvaged it. Obviously, you do not combine hot tea and ice cream, but you can combine hot fudge and ice cream and get something good. And that's because they are designed to complement each other. Tea and ice cream, they're not designed to complement each other, but hot fudge and ice cream, they are. So, if you look at something like mixing comedy and horror, specific kinds of both seem almost tailor-made to support each other. Let's say you want to do a satire. In fact, I can think of a specific example, Shaun of the Dead. Shaun of the Dead is a good modern mix of horror and comedy that strikes that proper balance. And one of the ways it implements this mixture is by using the comedy to make a new kind of commentary with the zombies. The primary joke of the film, especially for the first half, is that the characters are already kind of zombie-like in their own right. They're in this routine that they've been in for so long that it's become rote and they are stuck in it. They're just sort of wandering mindlessly through life to the point where it actually takes them a full day to realize that the zombie apocalypse has even happened. And that is a clever way to mix the comedy and the horror. Now, there aren't any fart jokes in Shaun of the Dead. It might have been able to get away with one if it was well-timed, but suppose that they had leaned into it and just filled the movie with fart jokes from start to finish, whether they were appropriate or not. That wouldn't have worked as well. That wouldn't have really had anything to do with the commentary, and therefore, Shaun of the Dead probably wouldn't be as fondly remembered as it is. But then again, it's not just the analogy The Closer Look uses to support his claim. He also says that the reason horror and comedy are such opposites is because of how they are structured as concepts. Specifically, horror is all about the building of tension, and comedy is all about the release of tension. So, you can't get more opposite than that, right? If you have one thing that's all about building and another that's all about releasing, well, they're going in two different directions. You can't mix those. Or can you? I can't help but think this statement, while not completely inaccurate, is also an oversimplification. So I agree that comedy is about the release of tension, and that release comes in the form of laughter. But how do you release that tension? Well, you gotta build it up first. The best kind of comedies are the kind that take you on a journey. I mean, you can just ramble off one-liners in a row rapidly and get some laughter. But the comedians and the comedic stories that really stand out are the ones that set up the dominoes before knocking them over. And you can see all of it building until you get to that moment where there is that release. And you can have the building of it be funny too, but it's when you finally get to the point where everything gets to a head and all the dominoes get knocked down, that's when you get the biggest laugh. That's when the biggest release of tension in the form of laughter comes. But you gotta build up to it first. On the other side of things, I also agree that horror is about the building of tension. Best kind of horror stories, the really scary ones, are the ones that fill you with that dread, not of seeing the monster kill someone, but of knowing the monster is out there and it can strike at any moment, but you're not sure when. And that one character who just happened to wander off by him or herself is in grave danger because the monster is just on the other side of the door. However, you don't necessarily want your story to be nothing but the buildup of tension all the way until the very end. Maybe you can get away with that in a shorter story, like a little short story that's a few pages long or a short film. But if you're doing a novel, a feature-length movie, or a full season of a TV series, you don't want it to be all built up with no release until the end. Because if you do that, one of two things is likely to happen. Either your story becomes an endurance test that the audience doesn't like and they feel miserable sitting through it and it's just plain unpleasant, or your audience gets bored waiting for something to happen because the monster or the killer or whatever is always lurking in the shadows threatening to kill but never actually does anything, and then they just start looking at their watches or skipping past pages, and you don't want that either. The way you avoid it is by providing little moments of release throughout the story. Nothing that will trump the big release at the end, of course, but just little things to provide that quick release and provide the audience with some relief. Sometimes that can come in the form of the monster actually doing something, but other times it can come in the form of a joke. And with that concept in mind, there's one reason why you can indeed mix horror and comedy. You don't necessarily want to overdo it if you're making a serious horror story, but a little bit of levity every now and then isn't a bad thing within it. It does provide that release. It lets off some of the tension so the audience can get a little bit of slack at least, and you can hold their attention as well by having something happen when maybe there isn't something happening otherwise. So if it is possible to use comedy within horror, then naturally it stands to reason that horror and comedy do indeed mix. And there is a very long tradition of horror comedies all throughout the ages. There are plenty of examples I can point to of films that are scary and funny. I mean, I already brought up Shaun of the Dead. There's also Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and even before that, all the Universal monster movies. You look at those movies and they do have moments in there that are specifically meant to be funny. There are characters in there who are the comic relief. If anyone in there is acting kind of over the top and goofy, it's not a case of bad acting from an earlier period. It's very deliberate. They were specifically put in there to provide a laugh before things get serious. But of course that does lead to the obvious question of, how do you even make a horror comedy? A lot of people have come up with works that are labeled as horror comedies, but quite a few of them really just lean more into the comedy level of it to become comedy films with a horror coat of paint. Or, in the opposite direction, horror movies that occasionally crack jokes. How do you strike that balance? how do you make a film that is equal parts funny and equal parts scary? Or any kind of story. I know I keep saying film, but any kind of story. Well, there is a film I can reference that works, and I already mentioned it once. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. All these years later, it is still considered one of the greatest combinations of horror and comedy out there. But how did it do that? Well, there are all kinds of nuances you can get into, but I think the most important aspect to consider is that the monsters in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein are never treated as a joke. Even though they can be involved in certain parts of the joke, they are not themselves treated as jokes. In fact, they're taken very seriously indeed. Dracula, the Wolfman, and the Frankenstein monster are not parodies of themselves in this movie. They are, in fact, their literal selves. Heck, this is the only other film besides the 1931 original where Bela Lugosi played Dracula. Since the movie takes them seriously, the audience takes them seriously as well. The comedy comes from Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, and how they have their over-the-top reactions, or how they occasionally are completely oblivious to the danger that they are in. Consider a scene early on where the characters have already met Lawrence Talbot, and Lou's character, Wilbur, sees that Talbot forgot his suitcase. So, he brings it into his room, but doesn't find Talbot there. So he sits down to leave him a note, letting him know what's going on, and as he's writing, we see that Talbot, fully transformed into a werewolf, is creeping out and is stalking towards Wilbur with every intention of killing him. And it's only by sheer luck that Wilbur just sort of casually finishes and strolls out without the Wolfman ever touching him. And of course, adding to it is how after he's out safe and sound, he almost thinks of a reason to go back, but he decides not to. He never knows what danger he's in at that point. Every other point in the movie he does, though, and boy is that when Costello lets it out. And it's in those instances where it's Bud's character, Chick, who doesn't realize what's going on. And that leads to the comedy being even more enhanced because it's not just Lou screaming and freaking out, it's also his frustration at the fact that it's only happening to him and no one else seems to be experiencing it. It's only his plight, and that's a large part of where comedy comes from. But at the same time, we're never under any illusions that these monsters are going to leave Will alone if they ever catch him. They will kill him if they get him. Now, I suppose Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein did have a bit of an advantage because, as I said, the Universal movies did have a good sense of humor about them even as they were being serious films. But even so, it's still a great example of how you can combine horror and comedy and strike that perfect balance. Even knowing that Lou Costello himself wasn't really happy with the script, he thought it was terrible when he first read it, well, history has nevertheless proven that it's just his opinion. Everyone else thinks this movie is great. Now, please don't get the wrong impression about me making this video as a way of calling out the Closer Look or something. He makes good content for the most part. And frankly, like I said, I haven't seen The Predator, so I don't know if I agree with his assessment of the film overall. I just feel like that one sentiment of his, that horror and comedy can never be mixed, was wrong. And therefore I wanted to provide my own outlook to show you that it can be done. There are plenty of examples of how it can be done, and I can explain how it can be done. Granted, that does mean I've broken one of the golden rules of comedy, which says you never explain the joke or else the joke dies. But then again, Halloween is fast approaching, so if the joke did die, it can always come back. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer, signing off. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it, as well as subscribe to the channel for more content of a similar nature. Also, check the description for links to our Twitter, DeviantArt, and Patreon pages, as well as the Amazon link for the novel Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, penned by yours truly. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.